That's what I need, like garanimals.
See, and that would totally like indicate your age.
That I know what garanimals
And then
are.
I know what that is.
Yeah.
too. That's
Yeah,
like-
yeah.
That and I wore tough skins as a kid.
You know, I think it's really cool.
Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Ms. Goodell, if you would call the roll. Here. If you'll join me for the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So we're going to go ahead and get started with the work session tonight. And first up will be a talk about the new Family Resource Center and an update there. I'll turn it over to Dr. Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, board members and community and staff. We really appreciate you being here on the Tuesday night before break starts. So we have a full agenda this evening. We've got 7 items we're excited to sort of talk about and work through this evening, and are confident that it will be useful to this board and also to the community as we move forward. Our first agenda item, as Mr. Webb indicated, is the Family Resource Center update. And I'm very excited and pleased to welcome my partner in life and my partner in work and everywhere else, Dr. Bethany Latique, who's a professor at George Mason University, who has worked very closely with a number of folks here in the City of Falls Church Schools to help develop the Family Resource Center over at Thomas Jefferson. And before she gets started, I just want to give a little bit of a shout out to a few of our folks that have been so instrumental in pulling this together. Certainly Lisa High and her leadership as the Chief Academic Officer has been extraordinary. Jen Santiago, who is our new LEAP coordinator, has been instrumental in pulling this together. Jeannie Seabridge, who's also one of our instructional coordinators, has been a huge help. And then Erica Zabalos, who is the parent liaison here in FCCPS, has really sort of taken the lead on some of this work and done an extraordinary job. But they weren't alone in their work. And I think one of the things that we're excited to share with you tonight, or Dr. Latique will share with you tonight, is the process of how this came together, the work that was done by a community advisory board, and kind of where we are now. So with that, unless Lisa, you have anything you'd like to add, I'll turn it over to Dr. Latique, and you'll just push your button to turn the light green on the microphone. And then, Dan, can we get the PowerPoint? Thank you.
Welcome, Dr. Latique.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share this work. And I will. Yeah, it's that flat, yeah. Great. Okay, start the timer. So I'm just going to tell you a little story about how this came to be, and then I'm happy to answer questions either while I'm talking or after if you have other questions. I want to acknowledge as Superintendent Noonan, we call him Super Noonan, in our these parts, but this presentation, I might be delivering it, but I really stand on the shoulders not only of the staff members acknowledged, but the FRC advisory board and my students. So, and you'll see some of them during the presentation. Now, is this, I have to turn it on? Sorry. Okay, I see. All right. Technology is not my strong suit. So it's probably doesn't need to be stated why family engagement is important. I'm a family scientist. That's my area of expertise. And so in studying families, most of what I do is to try to understand family systems and the ways in which other institutions and systems either support family functionality or perhaps hinder it, particularly families who occupy the margins of our society. But regardless of where families are socially located, the research is really clear that parent, family, and community engagement in education correlates highly with academic performance and school improvement. So one of the challenges to schools is, particularly schools when they're seeking to be more inclusive and increase family engagement, is to assess the relationship quality and trust between the school, family, and community to challenge misperceptions and create new opportunities of, by, and for all families, especially those who are historically and systematically marginalized. So I've really dedicated my career to a different kind of research approach called community-based participatory research. And this research really centers on building community university partnerships. In this case, we partnered with FCCPS and some of the families that reside on the margins. This work began in one of my classes, actually, because Peter often comes to one of my classes to talk about career pathways and his career trajectory. And we got to talking about ways we might be able to collaborate. And the students got really excited about the idea of maybe starting a resource center or looking at the possibility of a family resource center here in Falls Church City. Central to the work that I do is to form advisory boards. In partnering with communities, we seek to build boards that are populated with the members we wish to serve, or those members who occupy those vulnerable locations in society, because we want to empower them to guide us and to lead the work because they know what they need, and they can help us figure out how to better align our programs and services to what they need or where they are and what they're able to access, if that makes sense. So in this case, we partnered with 9 parents or guardians, and then the FCCPS staff, and the research team at George Mason, which included, I think at the end, I think we had 6 interns who I worked with over a summer. So the first task that we set to accomplish was to conduct a needs assessment in the summer. And we met with staff and community service folks, and we conducted a series of interviews and focus groups to hear from various constituencies, LEAP teachers, principals, assistant principals, etc. And we also spent time interviewing families. And how we gained access to these families was through our advisory board. So those individuals helped us to gain entree into the community, in this case, a Latino immigrant community, and to then sit with them and do some in-depth interviews to learn a little bit more about their lived experiences. And so what I'm going to do for a good part of my talk is to really just tell you 4 stories of 4 families that are part of your community. And so you can get a better sense of some of the challenges that they might be facing. The first profile is a mother from Central America, and she's lived in the city for 10 years. She has a 12th grade education, and she has 1 son. Let's see, she speaks just a little bit of English and is able to read a little. Now, she lives in an apartment with 3 bedrooms, and each room is rented. Well, she rents 1 room, and then a couple rents another room, and an individual rents the 3rd room. So she occupies her room with her family. And this is actually a fairly common living arrangement among immigrants in northern among low-income immigrant families in Northern Virginia. And I can talk a little bit more about my broader research program where we're working to document that. I also just wanted to point out the income situatedness of folks. So in this case, the monthly rent is $16.25, although I think it went up recently in the fields. This mother's portion is $1,000 a month, and she works about 40 hours and earns roughly $2,000 a month gross. And so there's not a lot of extra. And when I asked about her concerns about the school, she said her main obstacle was trying to communicate with the school, particularly when there wasn't front office staff that spoke Spanish, and that was a challenge for her, but that she really wanted to communicate or participate. There were just some barriers around language. The second family is a father from Central America also, living here since 1994. And this family was really a very traditional nuclear family system where he was working about 60 hours a week to make ends meet, and his wife was a stay-at-home mother. And I share this story because there's just great diversity. So I don't want you to walk away with this monolithic idea of what immigrant families are. Family structures are diverse. Their needs and challenges are diverse. And so, take that for what it's worth. And so the third family is a mother who has 3 kids, and her oldest son is back in her country of origin, and she is a single parent rearing 2 children under the age of 10 here. And the vast majority of the parents that we spoke to were undocumented. Some might have had TPS, which also seems to be a little insecure right now in terms of whether that status is going to hold. But in her case, she was a very vulnerable parent. She rents a room in a 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment and pays $900 per month plus utilities. She's very fearful of eviction, and there are some significant power differentials in these apartments if you are not the leaseholder. The leaseholder often will occupy the apartment and rent out one of the bedrooms to a renter. Even if both individuals are undocumented, there's still some significant power issues because that person is often fearful that if they're too loud, if their children are too disruptive, if they don't behave, if they break some rules within the household, they can be evicted like that. And that was she was very fearful, and during the interview was very tearful and very nervous when speaking about her circumstances. She works in a restaurant and she makes approximately $1,400 a month. So again, very financially and food insecure. She says her needs are language supports, but she also says I need access to healthcare, affordable housing, legal aid services, immigration services, and more information about citizenship pathways. And the fourth family that I'll mention was a mother from Central America who was in an abusive relationship. She was able to get out of that relationship with her young daughter who has significant special needs. They have stabilized in an apartment where they're doubled up with another family renting the 2nd bedroom. And like other families I've been talking about, they live pretty close to the bone. And in this case, the interview really focused on how hard it was for her to navigate the school system and understanding things like IEPs and how to to best meet her daughter's needs. And she said, in the beginning, I was provided with a translator, but now, no, I don't understand the scores. Special education is difficult for me to understand. I want them to tell me how to help my child. And she was very frustrated about that because she just didn't get it. She didn't know what she should be doing differently, and felt very stymied by that. When I asked the advisory board, I shared these pictures because this is from a different study that I conducted in Alexandria, but sometimes photos speak volumes. And when I asked the board, do these photos represent what it looks like to live in your community? They said, yes, please share these with the board when you give your talk. And I just point out that it's not uncommon when a whole family is living in a bedroom that the bedroom is all bed. And you can see that in the photo on the right. And the photo in the middle, you'll see that in these rooms, families keep everything, their pots, their pans, their food, their toiletries, their toilet paper. And the other thing that there's a lot of misconceptions oftentimes about immigrant families who are living in close quarters, that they must all know each other, there must be this network of support, but this often is not the case. In fact, we call this study Living with Strangers, and in the picture on the left, when I open the cupboard, I'm quite nosy when I do these interviews, and I poke around the fridge and the cupboards, and I ask if I can take pictures. And you'll see in this picture there are 4 Morton salt shakers. And when I asked about that, I'm like, what's going on? Well, each one of those shelves is a family's, that's their shelf. That's all the food storage that they have for their family. So, and there's not sharing, because when resources are so tight, you kind of hold on to what you have. It doesn't mean that someone can't borrow some salt, but there's a high degree of respect for individuals' property and food. But that picture also suggests that we should be thinking about food insecurity, and even things like, I don't know if, I think there's a backpack, like a weekend backpack program here where you send food home, and I'm not critical of that program, but for these families, getting food over the weekend, they don't necessarily have a place to store it, and they might not have access to a kitchen to prepare that food. And so when you're food insecure, getting a backpack stuffed with food might not be what they need to meet their family's food needs. And that's why these advisory boards become really seminal to the work, because we can go to them and say, so what should we be doing, so that we can differentiate our services, and so we're best meeting all of our families' needs. And the other thing I'll say really briefly is that when I share these stories with teachers, they often begin to deeply understand the circumstances of their children and their students, in their classroom. That these students are mingling with students who have quite a lot of resource, and yet these kiddos might not be sleeping well. They don't necessarily have a quiet place to do their homework. They're very stressed about their familial circumstances. There's a high degree of fear of deportation and family separation. And so how do schools meet these kiddos' needs that are, they're uniquely positioned, particularly in a school system like Falls Church City? I'm not going to go through all of this. I'll share my slides with you. These are just a deeper dive into some of the findings. I will say that certainly translated materials are really helpful to families, but in one of our studies in Alexandria, 48% of the families that we surveyed had less than a sixth grade education, and 20% of families had less than a second grade education. And so we started to really question the literacy levels of parents, not just in English, but in Spanish as well. And so if we just translate documents, are we communicating well with all of our families? And a lot of times translated materials lack context, and so they're not always that useful. And so might there be other ways of communicating? For example, some communities use robocalls, and they just verbally or orally transmit information to families rather than relying just on the written word. A lot of families also just really struggle to navigate the school system. If you haven't had a formalized education yourself, and then of course Northern Virginia education, it's hard enough to navigate with high degrees of education and resource. That's another area of real struggle. Certainly the staff had quite a lot to share as well, and I won't go too deeply into the weeds, but I liked the sentiment that was captured in the first line there. We see student and family needs, said the staff. We care about all of our families, and that certainly came through in our conversations. But they recognize that we often do not have the resources to meet needs, and we often work on a case-by-case basis and wonder sometimes about whether we're being really effective or efficient given our given the resource and the alignment of services, things like that. So presenting this research back to the advisory board, they came up with really 4 areas or vision for the FRC offerings of, by, and for families, to include the need for trusted parent liaisons. And it was wonderful to hear that Erica Ceballos she became a full-time employee, and I think there's hope that in the future there might be additional investment in parent liaisons to support those navigational supports that families need. The board also saw the Family Resource Center as a resource bridge, right? So this is just one of those ways in which a school can extend its reach into community, offering school-based toolkits, programming, language classes, reunification supports, for example, for parents and children, or parenting classes. There's all kinds of things that this community could benefit from. But the third or fourth bullet that the board really emphasized, which was really meaningful to me, is that this wasn't just a resource for them, but they also saw the Family Resource Center as being a resource to the school, where they could offer professional development of teachers, staff, and administrators, and share their knowledge and expertise with the schools to, again, increase the ability for the school and the community to really align with each other to best support the needs of the families. So the board came up with this mission very quickly, and it was really fun. They decided that their mission was making a difference in our little city so that all families thrive. And so that is the bulk of what I wanted to share with you. And I just, again, wanted to thank the families, teachers, staff, principals, and administrators for spending so much time with us. The board that I hope will be sustained as an integral part of the FRC. My students were dedicated, and they continue to serve the school and the FRC, providing translation supports, building a resource guide, and doing other things like that. And we hope that there are internship opportunities where they can continue to sustain this partnership between George Mason University and FCCPS. And thanks also go to Jeannie and Eric and Jennifer for all of their work. And that's it. I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? Mr. Castillo?
I'll go. Thank you for an interesting presentation. Is there anything different about, in comparison to other studies you've done, is there anything different about Falls Church in your mind, or are there similarities? How put Falls Church in context with your experience?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a smaller community, I would say, but a growing community here, from what I understand. And I wondered, there was some thinking among some folks that the challenges faced by immigrant families in other communities weren't happening in Falls Church City. And I was mindful of that, but as I entered the homes of the families, I very much felt at home, if you will, saying, oh no, the circumstances are very similar. Families aren't often wearing their stories on their sleeves. It's not safe to share what's happening and their concerns. They don't want to bring attention to them, and so it's often hidden. But from what I could see, the housing circumstances are just so tenuous that when you're struggling every single day to meet your basic needs and your family's basic needs, school is absolutely a priority to these families. In fact, that's why they're here, right? They're risking everything. Parents have given up everything for their children to have access to a high quality education. But they experience incredible challenges and stressors, to include, I might add, trauma exposures from pre-migration, migration, and post-migration to the United States. And of course, most of these traumas have gone untreated because there's no access to any kind of health care to address those issues. In my other studies, and I suspect in actually we have some data that can validate what I'm about to say, but in my Alexandria study, 50% of parents were expressing depression symptomology in the range for clinical concern. And the majority had experienced significant post-trauma stress, and about a quarter of the sample was currently experiencing PTSD symptoms that really required some sort of trauma-informed care. We saw similar patterns in Falls Church City. So I don't know that there were that many differences, but I think the challenges in the Northern Virginia region for this community are fairly great.
So just to follow up, is there a regional piece to this puzzle? Should we be trying to coordinate our efforts to help these families by bringing in resources and perspectives from Arlington, Fairfax County, Alexandria?
I think a coordinated response would be great. I know that in certain circles there are coordination efforts going on. Peter and I actually...
I just worry that there's sort of the law of small numbers in Falls Church, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's there's a lot around us
Mm-hmm.
on several fronts, and sometimes I think there are great perspectives available right on our doorstep, but we tend to think, well, we have to do it in the Falls Church context, as opposed to thinking a little more broadly.
Yeah, and there are lots of things going on right now in terms of even building programs around family reunification. where parents are reunifying with their children and helping that reunification process along. So you don't have a lot of externalizing behavior problems or internalizing behavior problems in children in schools, to really support the socio-emotional and cognitive development of children. We also do a lot of work around deportation planning. We work with legal teams to support, help families fill out, for example, powers of attorney for children and property in case they're detained, so that they know their children will be taken care of until they can be reunited at a certain point. These were all kinds of things that these families also were interested in. And yeah, and in that case, there are larger efforts going on in the region that speak to some of those things. I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but I do think that Falls Church City could tap resources and look to other communities to as partners and bring those resources to bear here. And I think it would go a long way.
Ms. Gill?
Thank you so much. That was really impactful. How can we as a board and a community support the FRC going forward? What's needed in terms of staffing and budget so that this project continues to grow and support everyone as they come in?
That's a great question. For sure, figuring out how to sustain a board is, I think, really important to empower that board to help with those alignments of services. And one of the ways that we do that is certainly through staffing, to be able to bring those folks together. I also, I have always paid the board to participate in my projects because it's meaningful. And so that's something that we actually did with this board as well. And continuing those kinds of, that kind of resource sharing, I think is really important. I mean, the staff, the FCCPS staff, and the board both said, we want a parent liaison in every school. We would love to have those liaisons and those navigators really helping parents across the school system, because as you know, each school can feel like its own unique entity. And I know that you're a system of schools, but each school has its own sort of personality and its own, issues that parents have to figure out. And so, one parent liaison full-time for the entire school system, I think is still, in my opinion, falls far short of what best practices are around the region.
Can I add one thing to add to this conversation that I failed to mention at the beginning, is the payment of the board has been a really important component, and the Ed Foundation has sort of seeded some money at the very beginning to take care of some of that. So maintaining that relationship with the Ed Foundation will be important as well.
Other questions? Going once? Mr. Castillo?
So just one more question. How many families are we talking about here as far as you can tell? What's the size of the bread box here?
Oh, I don't know if I have that. You all might know the number. It's around two, is it around, more children, around 200 and...
The total number of LEAP students that we serve is between about 180 and 200. So when you think about numbers of families, it's going to be less than that because there are multiple kids in single families. But I tend to think that it was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 120 families. So it's not an insignificant number considering the size of our division.
And if you look at the, I know we look at things like metrics like SOL scores and things like that. And so, I think I would guess that an investment in supporting parent engagement through better navigation within the school system, better understanding of the ways in which they can support their children, and also for the school system to understand the stressors that these kids are facing, and really and kind of work to do that dance. I think you know, I think that's a necessary action if you want to see sort of improvement in certain, in some of those SOL scores. And one other thing that came up, I'll mention really quickly, but I thought it was pretty powerful. The board, the Family Resource Center board said, why do you single us out? Why do you call us a special population? We don't like that. We already, we feel marginalized with the language. And is it necessary? Because our children already are feeling like othered in all kinds of ways within the schools. And so might there be other words to label people than the current labels? And even that just felt really meaningful to me. If you want to engage families, not a good idea to build relationships by othering. And I know that's not an intentional thing, but that's one of those moments where we're like, oh, I don't want to do that. So then how can we move differently so that we're starting off on the right foot, even in building those relationships?
So I guess when I hear this presentation and see this information, for me, it's extremely overwhelming, as I'm sure it probably is for a lot of people who encounter it. And to me, it's such a massive undertaking. And so I see a lot of research here, but I'm just curious, if the next step then is to identify what specific action steps, because there's so many action steps that I'm just wondering how you're going to go about how I guess the advisory board is going to go about prioritizing what needs to be done and how we're going to do it. Obviously the finances are a big part of that, but even if everything was free, it just seems like such a massive undertaking. I'm just curious if you started breaking it down into action steps.
There are a lot of challenges, right? So it can feel overwhelming. Those original, I don't know if I can, starting with sort of the low-hanging fruit, it's not that hard to build better navigation pathways. The resource guide in English and Spanish, building parent liaisons and volunteers who are well-versed in that resource guide. So when parents have questions, they can be routed and shown this is where to go, this is who to talk to, this is a friendly person you can feel safe with to share your story if you have some concerns. So building those navigational supports, building the resources, school-based toolkits, what to expect when you're entering first grade, what to expect when you're entering third grade, and those sorts of things are just the real start there, because registering children, getting them registered, filling out forms. So we do Form Aid. This is really basic, but we bring students into the community and we have Form Aid days where we help parents fill out the forms. Because if you check the wrong box, you can end up with your child in a space that you don't necessarily want them in. So Form Aid is helpful, but again, one parent liaison won't be able to do that. So one of the things that at George Mason we're hopeful to keep sustaining is that that partnership where our students can support that work, and they get experience that's valuable to them, and that can expand your reach as well. And then from there, I think there are, lots of other places you could go, but that's where I would start.
I guess when I look at this, one of the things that obviously stands out the most is just the poverty issue. And I think that, you can offer a lot of resources and, do a lot of great toolkits and stuff, but I guess my bigger concern is, at the end of the day, if your primary focus is just on feeding your family or a place to sleep, it just seems like that's also a daunting challenge too. And so I just think of like in my personal life where I have none of those concerns, I oftentimes can barely read through the emails from school about what I'm supposed to be doing and when and where I'm supposed to be doing it. So I think that, and not to like, I think this is all fantastic work and I'm not meaning to criticize it, but I guess there's just a lot of things bouncing around in my head in terms of how massive this undertaking really is, given all the challenges that are thrown up. And
Yeah, I'm keenly interested in housing, and I ask communities all the time, what do you want your community to look like? And what are you willing to give up, or what are you willing to sacrifice in order to have socioeconomic diversity among you? And with Amazon HQ2, what's it going to look like? And where are folks going to live? And so, I do think, it's certainly layered. We also work on, policies and laws and work with the state legislature to try to address some of the other challenges that families, getting a driver's license. There's all sorts of issues that you could focus on. I do want to say, however, that when you ask families, is life better here than back home? Hands down, it is better here. The schools, the resources, the access to a high quality education is so valuable that suffering is, it's all relative. And so I'm not going to say that there aren't hardships here, because there are, but the parents would say, life is so much better here than back home. And so that is a real buffer to them, that what might seem like lacking to us, they're like, but it's safe here, and we have access to things that we don't back home. And so I also, I hold on to that too, when I'm feeling overwhelmed, that, perception is also important here. And the families are resilient and resourceful and are really grateful to be here.
Look, if you have questions, Joe?
You touched on this a little bit, but I think my question is kind of about like the broader community. There's things we can resource the schools to do. Have you seen any examples of a community where kind of the broader community has done a good job of sort of bridging that gap between kind of the wealthier and the people who are struggling? Have you seen any good examples out there of ways people have done that?
It's a good question. I feel really passionately that many people are working to do a lot of good work. What oftentimes we fail to do is sit down with the folks that we're hoping to help and ask them, what do you need and what do you value? And I think any community that wants to be a good partner to an immigrant community, such as the families we've been focusing on, I think is to sit with them and build trusted relationships with them and let them guide, because there's like the holidays are coming up and a lot of people are like, oh, let's do Christmas giveaways or whatever. But that actually can make families, it can be a mixed blessing to a family because they get overwhelmed with a lot of gifts. there are a lot of issues. Sometimes a family that has an undocumented child isn't eligible to participate in certain giving programs. And so you can have one child who is eligible, and that creates a lot of turmoil and hardship within the family. So, so I think what I hope to leave you, the message I hope to leave behind is whatever you do and whatever other communities are doing, I think it's incredibly important to empower the community to lead and to trust that they know what they need, and to, if you really want to do this work, then let them guide you. Yeah, thank you.
Do we have a board liaison to the FRC advisory board?
There is not a board liaison. Phil Reidinger has been the LEAP liaison, but they are separate, right? So the FRC really needs to remain separate from the LEAP advisory. And what are your thoughts about having a board liaison or staff liaison to the FRC?
I'm of two worlds. I think on the one hand, that would be great. On the other hand, there's also something really powerful about having sort of a group that is on its own and feels empowered to sort of do what they need to do for themselves. For example, if they wanted to run some deportation legal clinics or something, that might be nice to have that sort of as a separate entity. That makes sense. But I also think finding those pathways to bring those voices to the board and to the city council, et cetera, are also like really, really important.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that they continue to be heard, so it doesn't get lost, so they aren't in a room and then no one's hearing from them and we're not getting the input. But so not to be a watchdog or to guide their discussion anyway, just to make sure that we, hear all this. And then we can engage the community to also help. I know so many people would sit down and fill out a form with somebody, or instead of a backpack, bring a home cooked meal if that's easier. I think a lot of people would say, like, I will help in any way I can if you just tell me what to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else? And just, this was a very, very powerful presentation to kind of see, because again, I think a lot of folks kind of don't realize those folks live within our community, because they do make every effort, I think sometimes because of reasons that you just stated, to fly as under the radar as they can, but they are a growing part of our community, and trying to find ways to be of assistance to them, and that we can, I think, is always good in the small ways that we can for them, just helping to, if just navigating how the school system here works and making sure that these parents who risk life and limb to sometimes get here to make their children's lives a little bit better than theirs, and helping them at least in that small part of what we can, I think is a really good thing. And as Ms. Gill was saying, I think they're making sure that the board has an opportunity, if not a direct liaison, but some type of way that they know that they can circle to come to us to kind of keep us updated on things that they might feel that we need to know about, and or ways that we can potentially assist them within the process. Because hearing of within the kind of how we label them, and that they kind of like, and I can actually probably see a little bit of that probably, because it does make them kind of stand out a little bit more within their already, the ways that they already are living within things going on within today's world. But I think this is a great tool, and I'm glad that your students got so excited about this and getting us to this point now that we at least have resources to try to help those families to kind of navigate the system better, and whatever ways we can try to work to expand on and making sure this process kind of stays around and continues to do what it has already seems like in this short period of time has already started to do, that we can continue to have it a part of the city. But thank you very much for
Yeah, thank you.
hanging out with us a little bit
Yeah,
tonight.
thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
All right. So next up, we're going to be talking about rezoning ordinance. So I'll turn that over to Dr. Denny.
Great, thank you. I'm going to invite Carly Aubrey up. Carly is the principal planner and West Falls Church project manager. Start with congratulations on the naming of EYA PN Hoffman as the new developer for the West Falls Church site. I think you all made have a great partner in hand who really is going to pay attention to the school, and we're excited about that. So Ms. Aubrey tonight is going to do a very brief presentation about the zoning amendment that has been put forth around the West Falls Church site. So I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you, Carly Aubrey with the City of Falls Church. And I'm going to talk just briefly about the ordinance, why we're doing it, and how it relates to other recent land use actions the city has taken, and then kind of our next steps for the ordinance. So on October 9th, the City Council granted first reading for an ordinance to amend the city's official zoning district map to rezone the 34 acres at the west end from R1A low density residential to B2 central business. And they referred it out to the Planning Commission, the Economic Development Authority, and the school board. So when the site was annexed into the city as part of the 2013 boundary adjustment agreement with Fairfax County, it was zoned R1A low density residential. And that's our default zoning whenever we bring land into the city according to our zoning ordinance. So the intent of the proposed ordinance is to provide a suitable zoning designation that would allow for the future of the land to reflect plans for the new high school, signal the city's intention to facilitate and support significant mixed-use development, and to be consistent with the recent land use actions. So the first land use action was in January of this year when the city amended Chapter 4 of the Comprehensive Plan, and that was to add text including specific goals and strategies for special revitalization districts for education and economic development. And that concurrently amended the future land use map to provide designations of park and open space with school symbols on approximately 24 acres and mixed use on approximately 10 acres of the subject site. And it also overlaid the site with the special revitalization district. Following in August, the City Council adopted an ordinance amending the B2 district in the zoning ordinance. And this provided text to allow elementary and secondary schools up to 7 stories to be built by right in a special revitalization district. And it also added new special exception provisions for mixed use developments within those districts. So this zoning map amendment that I'm presenting tonight would allow the application of these amended B2 zoning rules to the subject site. So staff is recommending the approval of this ordinance because it's consistent with the 2 land use actions I just mentioned, and it will accommodate anticipated special exceptions and site plans for the mixed use project and will permit additional height for the new planned high school. And additional factors include trends of growth or change in the area and encouragement of the most appropriate use of land throughout the city. In terms of the schedule, Planning Commission provided a recommendation of approval on November 6th, and the Economic Development Authority provided a recommendation of approval on November 6th. The second submission of our traffic impact analysis is under review by VDOT, and we expect an approval from that any day now, I hope. And then the second reading from City Council is scheduled for December 10th. So that is my presentation, and I can take any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? Mr. Anderson?
Thanks, Ms. Aubrey. It may just be the power cord. Thanks, Ms. Aubrey. My only real question right now is just to confirm this rezoning is completely aligned with the agreement with Fairfax County for the land transfer back in 2013 and the ratio of the uses of the property for the for educational purposes and then for other purposes, right? Just to
Yes.
reconfirm that.
Yeah, B2 zoning district, it already allows public facilities such as schools, and then, that recent text we did allowed, for increased height for schools. And then it also allows for mixed use, so it's all included in the B2 allowed uses.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Mr. Castillo?
Thanks, Ms. Ari. Just a question, what is, for example, TJ zoned as?
That is R1, no. R1, no. It's Parks and Open, well, okay. It's R1A, yes. The problem with R1A is, schools by right in those districts only provide for a height up to 45 feet. So, which would not accommodate, the new planned high school.
So I guess asking the question another way, is there another designation besides Parks and Open Space with two schools that you could designate the educational component?
Well, so the Parks and Open Space is actually the land use map designation, which is consistent with which is TJ. TJ has a land use designation of, Parks and Open Space. So this is actually for the zoning district, to be B2. So, which is slightly different than how, TJ is, but that's, right now, that's a by right, meets the R1A by right height.
And then just going back to building height issues, where are we now if somebody wants to build a 80-story pencil,
School.
New York City type condo, and we don't want the shadows falling on the George Mason site? How does that work out in terms of our raising concerns, and what weight does our
Well, for the
input have?
the special exception for the mixed use project, they are allowed up to 15 stories. And since that is done through a special exception, it's not a by right process. So it does go through a more rigorous, public hearing, public review process. And so that's one of the things that we will be looking at, is where those taller buildings are going to be in relation to the school, and shadow studies and that sort of thing.
So, where's the shadow study?
It'll be submitted as part of their upcoming applications. Mhm.
Some billionaire proposing some very tall, expensive building. What voice do the school board have? And what decision power would you say?
Well, they would still be required to go through the special exception process, and the school board will be one of those reviewing boards and commissions. So any application will come to the board for your input.
But we don't have a veto power.
Technically, I don't think so, but the council does, the council does a very good job of taking in consideration all the boards and commission comments.
Any other? Okay. What's, next steps, for me at all?
So the next steps are, if you all are in agreement, and we can just sort of by consensus get a sense for, if you're okay with moving this forward, I think that would be sufficient.
Are there any folks who have, any questions, concerns about endorsing this, the rezoning? Mr. Castillo?
I would really like to know where the shadow studies fit into all this before we go down that road. I think otherwise you're doing it backwards.
So may I make a suggestion? Since we have a little bit of time before the council is going to take it up for second reading, knowing that today is the 18th of, the 20th of November, it gives us a little bit of time between now and when they take it for second reading. So how about if we do this? What if by Wednesday, the 28th, if you have questions that you'd like to send me to pass along to the council, or to the city manager, I'd be happy to do that. And then I'll ask him to turn those questions around as quickly as we can, fan those out to you. And then we'll get a sense from you at that point about where you are around the 30th, or the first part of December, first week of December. So if there are, so I've got where are we with the shadow studies would be the first question.
Or even, can we just ask our architects, you know, it's almost, we're getting near the shortest day of the year. What would a 15-story building shadow look like on the proposed site? I mean, just back of the envelope kind of thing.
And I'll just add with the special exception process, that's part of an application requirement that they'll be submitting. What this ordinance does is put in place the zoning that then enables somebody to apply for a special exception. So this is kind of that first enabling step. So then the schools can submit a site plan for a 7-story high school, and the economic developer can apply for a special exception entitlement, which will include not just shadow studies, but a whole menagerie of different things.
I'd actually like to push the board just a little bit more. If we could have them by Monday. Any questions that you have? Because I think they'd like to have the comments and back by the 28th.
So Ms. Albert, I guess my question to you, kind of following up on what Mr. Casillo's talking about, looking at shadow studies of kind of figuring out where we are now, would that be something that we are asking about that? Are we asking a little too soon for something jumping that deeper into the process? As we don't, or is it at least having it out there that we have some concern about a potential project, and if something goes up to 15 stories, and the shadow that it may cast over the school?
No, I mean, it's definitely good to get any concerns that you might have as the process moves forward on the books is fine. So, you know, there are very conceptual plans that they've provided in their RFDP. I don't know if that's enough to really do an adequate shadow study until they actually submit for the special exception, so.
Okay. So if, again, as Dr. Noonan just suggested, if board members have other questions that they may have to pose to the city manager, if you all will get them to them by Monday. Thank you very much, Ms. Aubrey.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to department goals and action plans. Dr. Noonan?
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Aubrey, as well. I'm going to invite our awesome directors up to the table. And I'm going to turn it over here to Kristen in just a second to set it up even further. But I feel very lucky tonight to be able to welcome our directors to share with you some examples of some of the goals that they are setting and working on, along with their action plans with respect to the work that their operations are engaging in. The thing that I'm perhaps the most excited about is at the last meeting you all adopted my goals. And that's that same meeting you adopted the triennial plan. Tonight we share the operating goals, and at the next work session we're going to share the school's goals as well. And one of the things that I'm really hopeful that you'll see is really good alignment from school board down to classroom levels to operations. So not only will they look and feel very similar in terms of the template that you see up here, that has been used at the school and in operations, but there is 100% alignment to the placemat that we've put together around the work of our schools. So tonight, I would invite you to look at that alignment, because what we do know about really great organizations is that really great organizations have alignment from top to bottom and bottom to top. And when we fall out of alignment, that's when things get a little bit, dare I say, wonky. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Michael.
So thank you so much for the opportunity this evening to share our department's action plans with you. I'm joined by the directors of each of the departments, and with us tonight, I have Nancy Hendrickson, our transportation director, Sevi Padilla, our facilities and securities director, Amy Hall, our HR director, Richard Kane, our food service director, Michelle Kopic, our budget and finance director, and Dang Nguyen, our IT director. Katie Clinton couldn't be here tonight. She's at home recovering from surgery, but she is with us in spirit. So the action plans that they're going to be sharing with you tonight are just examples of how all the work that we're doing to achieve the goals of our triennial plan and the division goals from the placemats are really guiding the work that we do. So for tonight's presentation, I went ahead and selected one action plan item from each of our departments. And I picked those on purpose, really to show how each of our departments is supporting all areas of our 3 goals in the placemats, right? They're supporting our deploying best practices for teaching, learning, and operations, how we're helping to close the achievement gap with an emphasis on our special populations, and how we're ensuring operational effectiveness and efficiency. So there's a ton of great work going on in our departments. I'm really proud of all the work that each of them are doing. So I'm going to turn it over to the team who's going to share that one action plan example from each of their departments. So Dang Nguyen, our IT director, is going to kick it off.
So one of the smart goals that the IT department will implement next year is to implement a self-service password reset portal for all the users. To reduce the lockout time for the student and the staff. To reset their password, they have to verify their identity and answering the question that they previously respond to during the setup. Activity, we're gonna meet monthly to evaluate the new software to meet the existing requirement. And before we roll out the portal, we're gonna communicate to all the users and said how they gonna reset their password. The person responsible will be me, and the IT department will lead this project. And for the timeline, I would like to have this one done by before the school start next year. For the assessment improvement, we're gonna generate report for logout user and password expired user, so we can see the statistic of the data, so we can tell who been to the portal and reset their password.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share some of the activities that we are engaged in. And in budget and finance, one of the goals that I've set for our department is right in line with deploying best practices. And it really is maximizing our resources that we've had entrusted to us. And that goal is to train our principals and directors on Munis procedures to help them fully utilize the tool in budget management and purchasing decisions. And I would say that most of the directors and principals have shared with me that they know what they want to get out of the system, but they don't know how to get it out of the system. So we will be implementing a training in the spring as a component of that with the Munis upgrades that are currently being implemented. We will have a dashboard interface into Munis, which is going to allow is going to ease access to Munis for our principals and directors because it's going to be a web-based access. They don't have to be tied to their desktop or VPN and take over their desktop. So it's going to be much more accessible. So we really want them to be able to utilize this tool. So we're going to have a training in the spring, and we will talk to them about their needs prior, and then we will survey them afterwards to get a gauge of their confidence in their ability to extract the data that they need for their best decision making. So that's our goal, and I am excited to implement that in the coming months.
So the next goal is for extended daycare. Their goal is to establish program operational standards. So as you may remember, in May of 2018, the extended daycare program is no longer required to be licensed by the Virginia Department of Social Services due to a change of Virginia law. School-age, school-based programs are now overseen by their respective school boards. So the extended daycare program has been using the VDSS licensing standards to develop their own operational standards. The purpose of those new standards is going to be to ensure that their activities, services, and facilities of each program is conducive to the well-being and the development of the children that they serve, and to reduce the health and safety risks in their childcare environment. These operational standards are going to be enforced through announced and unannounced visits by the daycare director, and after they're developed, they'll be taken to the daycare board for their input and review. They expect to have all of this completed by the spring.
Oh, I was trying to concentrate. Good evening, everybody. My objective, my SMART goals are to increase lunch participation by 10%. And the way we're going to do this, the strategy we're going to take is by increasing awareness of the food service department's activities, which we haven't utilized as much as we should have in the past. And that's like using a website, making staff and students and faculty aware of some of the new menu items that we have that we have introduced this year, and also by recapturing the Mount Daniel population, seeing that Revolution Foods, this was their last day today in their food. And that's my plan to do this by the end of the current school year.
Well, my item is not as appealing as Richard's. The human resources goal that I'm going to share with you is about streamlining and improving the application and new employee hiring process, which is in line with the division goal of ensuring operational efficiency and effectiveness. So the system that we're using today for applications and hiring, which is KeyNet, has been the source of some delays and frustration. Our applicants have communicated that they're encountering system errors when trying to fill out an application, or they'll call with questions on how to complete the application or to confirm that their application was received. Additionally, our administrators periodically encounter problems when trying to hire certain candidates, and they end up having to reach out to HR to manually push that candidate through to the next step in the hiring process. So what we're going to do is we're taking a look at the HR component within the Munis system to see if it's a viable replacement for the functions that we're using in KeyNet for hiring and applications. One of the requirements for using that HR component is to be on the dashboard platform, which we are on, and we received training this month, so that piece has been completed. The next steps then are really going to be to dig into the solution in Munis to see if the functionality that we're using in KeyNet and that we need to be using, that there aren't any gaps between that and the solution that is available in Munis. So assuming that all goes well, our target is to transition the application process into Munis in time for the FY20 hiring, which will probably begin around the end of February, early March timeframe. And then targeting May of 2019 to have the application process fully transitioned to Munis and the hiring process and workflow automated.
So my SMART goal was to streamline the facilities request and community usage process of our buildings. Doing this by creating a new sort of one-stop shop website for all things sort of facilities. Basically allowing the community to have two ways to request space in our facilities. One, through just an easy-to-use Google form with providing all the information, and then we respond back and contact them with availability. Also, and then there's another way for our advanced users to actually log in our system directly, create a user profile, log in directly, and create the space on their own. So some of our renters, long-term renters, would do that way. Also providing access to through that website a public calendar, so anyone can go in and see what spaces are available at any time without having to log in or do anything. You can just type in you just choose what room and what space, what day, and it'll tell you if it's reserved or not already. So our target timeline to have this all completed was January 1st, but I've actually already finished the website. It's already live, and we've already started testing it and using it a little bit. So, yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Transportation SMART goal is to develop and evaluate options for future walk zones, bell schedules, and bus routes for all schools. Strategies would be to meet with admin staff and to actually discuss bell schedules, develop some bus route options based on those bell schedules and walk zones to best meet the needs of all of our students while maximizing the transportation resources and staffing that we currently have. Analyzing staffing and the use of contracted and time card staff. It will involve myself and the additional administrative teams. And we hope to have a decision, of course, so that we can implement any changes for the next school year, 19 and 20. And hopefully we can see some potential cost savings, which could result from less staff members needed, and vehicle inventory requirements could decrease based on changes with those walk zones and bell schedules.
So on behalf of all of the support departments, thank you this evening for giving us an opportunity to share these examples of our action plans.
Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Does any board member have any questions for any of the directors? If, Mr. Castillo?
I know there's some pool so that when I don't ask a question, somebody's going to make money. So thank you, everybody, for coming out and presenting your goals. Just while you're here, Mr. Dwayne, security is something we're all concerned about from time to time, and I don't want to go off topic, but maybe at some point we can have a conversation about that. And I don't know whether will this SMART goal enhance security for the students,
Yes.
for the system? And maybe you could work that into that SMART goal, because it'd be a good thing.
So right now, the student be able to reset the password only in campus, so they won't be able to reset the password from outside for the Active Directory. So either they have to be in school to reset a password, or one of the IT tech will help them to reset the password. So this portal gonna roll out, so it's gonna have like 2-step authentication, which is you have multiple email going in, or their text, that verification password, the email to them to verify whose identity, and this allow them to, to change the password in the future.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, good.
Just increase, yeah.
Because I think that's a good piece of
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
of that goal. I'll stop.
Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Sevi, we've had a lot of feedback from the idea of making the schools more, community use more easily done, and so I'm really glad to see this one. One of the things I'm curious about on the assessment in the end is how might you actually find out from the users how they're feeling about the new system? Is it better, easier to use? Is it giving them what they need? Beyond just measuring the use of the forms and things, actually sort of getting feedback on the quality of it.
I mean, we totally can, send out questionnaires or respond directly. We'll have all their information and just find out what they think at the end of, at the end of maybe a school year or an academic year, and see what they think. At this point, I haven't logged into it in the last couple of days to see how many people have used it. So I can't speak if anyone has any input now or not, but.
One of the things that we did early on when Sebi was working on this website is we had some people who had told us our site was really hard to use. So when we first rolled out this new website, we sent them that link and asked them specifically to give us feedback. So I think as we continue to work through this process, right, we'll continue to try to network to find out who those people are that are hard to reach. And we've also talked about really spending some time trying to push through morning announcements and other sites. Here's how you can register. Here's what the fees are. Really trying to see if we can increase the usage, right? Because one of the ways I think we can measure this effectiveness is, do we see an increase in the utilization of our space?
Ms. Russell?
So this is wonderful. I love all the goals. But Nancy, I was just curious with regard to the goal that you're proposing. Have you started looking at the different walk zones, and starting to model different bell schedules? And I'm just kind of curious, like how far along you are with that, or if you have any ideas of what that might look like.
Currently, we're just starting in that project and it gives us a unique opportunity with the second grade moving up to the Mount Daniel to reassess all of our needs and then of course if we open the walk zone to especially the middle school, that would also make a big difference in what our needs are. So being able to shift some of our resources around and hopefully even reduce some of our necessary bus runs, is what I'm looking at doing for the goals. But as far as have I started, we've just started.
And then I guess for the bell schedules, is like, have you started modeling that at all? And what, I guess, things that you might have in mind for that?
Right. A lot of that'll come with the school administrators. I mean, in transportation, what we do greatly affects everybody else. Basically, we're filling the needs of what the schools need. So I don't see high school, middle school looking to go away from matching their schedule. It took them a long time to do that. So that does tie our hands somewhat as far as trying to bring in a large number of students at the same time. But I think that we can come up with some creative options to consider and see if we can make some of that work out.
Just for purposes of information also, as they're working through their operating goals and as things like, for example, bell schedules, walk zones and the like come up, there will be work sessions around those down the line, just to make sure that you as a board and the community are also informed as we're working through these questions.
Ms. Layton?
Sevi, this is maybe a bad question because it sounds like you have just made a lot of progress on something the community's been asking us for. I'm just curious though, has there ever been any discussion kind of with the city? I'm assuming they have kind of their own system for people who want to use more city spaces. Have we ever thought of coordinating that at all? So it'd be kind of one-stop shop for city residents?
Well, they use a separate system than we use, and the reason we use, I say we, the facilities usage side uses the system that we use, which is called Our School Today. It's the same one that our athletics department uses, so that our schedules mesh. Previously, I was using one, athletics had one, city had one, and it was so many locations, even internally, just to try to match up all of our gym usage and everything. So we use the same one. The city has access to it. They input all of their stuff into our system automatically, and then we go in and just approve it as, make sure there's no conflicts. The city's welcome to join us. I don't know if we could maybe join them just because of the VHSO, all the stuff that they put in there. Yeah.
Ms. Russell?
Not to make it pile on Sevi night, but with the recent problems, I guess, at MEH with the gym floor there, has there been any communication from Parks and Rec regarding using potentially the new Mount Daniel gym for the basketball?
They were over there before we opened. They were ready to start using it. They're looking at it. They're planning it. They have not sent us schedules when they want to start, but I'm assuming it'll be some of their winter sports. Obviously, it'll be probably little kids over there, TJ age, like we're doing over there now. But yeah, it's coming, and they're planning on it.
Mr. Castillo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on the sign-up sheet, Mr. Padilla, how does it work? Is it like buying concert tickets that it opens at midnight and everybody can just rush in and lock down all kinds of space? Or is it done on a rolling basis that space is allocated? Are there going to be any equity and access concerns?
Well, I mean, all of our spaces are always, it's school first, whether it be athletics or internally. Community center or rec center has kind of second dibs, so to speak, and then it's in the outside group after that. And it's on a first come, first served basis. We try to give a little priority to some of the long-term groups, and if we know there's certain groups that use the auditorium, for instance, every single year, we try to have them already on the calendar. But sometimes they get bumped because of a school event or a community event, if we know it, well in advance. But yeah, I mean, we don't turn down anyone. It's just based on whoever comes to us, if we can work them in.
And then if I could just follow up with a question about the daycare, given that now there's no longer a licensure requirement from a governance standpoint, are we grading our own homework now, or how do we have a proper supervision if we're not having an outside party doing the supervising and setting the rules?
I think that's an excellent question, because you're right, since we're not following the previous licensing standards, we don't have that external monitor coming in. I think as Katie's working to develop these standards, what's going to be really important is that Daycare Advisory Board is going to sign off on those standards. Right, Katie herself will do monitoring visits to check each site to make sure they're meeting the standards, but hopefully that advisory board will also help in that initiative by providing oversight or requesting documentation in terms of ensuring that we're meeting those standards. But it's a definite step that we don't want to miss, because we want to make sure that we're providing the absolute best service to our students.
Anyone else? Want to thank you all for coming out this evening. We look forward to getting the updates on as you all take on these different tasks for over the next year. Thank you. Next up will be the FY19 monthly budget report. It looks like Ms. Michael is getting that.
She
over
is.
here.
Yep, she's getting that together. And as she does that, I just want to thank again our directors for coming out and wish them all a happy Thanksgiving and enjoy your few days off. This monthly budget report, of course, is the standard report that we've been putting out, and I'll let Ms. Michael take it over when she gets the presentation up. Go to view the agenda. Oh.
So this evening, we have the monthly budget report for October. I'd like to start off by thanking Michelle Kopic, who's here at the table with us tonight, for her continued efforts in terms of both the budget work and for processing all the financial transactions recently. Our accounts payable specialist has been out of the office with a family issue. So again, I really want to thank Michelle, not only for this budget work, but for all of her finance work as well. So the presentation this evening follows the same format as the prior months. The first chart shown on the screen right now shows the budget by significant category, and it provides the revised budget, the actual revenue or expenditures through October, any encumbrances or purchases that have been initiated, and then it shows the available budget in both dollars and percent. So for revenue, the available budget represents the budgeted revenue that's not yet received, and for expenditures, it represents the budget that's not yet expended. So just on an overall note, revenue is tracking as expected as compared to the prior years, which is shown on the dated table on page 2 and page 3. I think I can roll there. Okay. As shown in the data table, this is the data table on page 2, and there's a graphic on page 3. Each revenue category is currently very consistent with the prior 3 years, with the exception of federal revenue. So federal revenue represents for us reimbursements. So when we have expenditures, we then request reimbursement from those federal grant programs. And as you can see, we're trying to complete those earlier in the fiscal year. If you remember previously, we did most of those reimbursements at the end of the year. So we've started the process of requesting those earlier, and you can see that as a result, we've collected a higher percentage of our federal revenue than we have in the previous years. When we look at the expenditure side of the chart, October is still early in the school year, so we have 2 months of teacher salaries that have been expended to date. When we look at our salaries and benefits, they're both tracking consistently with the prior year. We're spending just a slight bit faster than we were previously. But all of our expenditures are really tracking exactly where we would think we would be at this year. With the exception of the impact of our additional capital expenditures for Mount Daniel. So if you remember at our school board meeting in September, we talked about funding those additional capital items for Mount Daniel. And some of those expenditures have posted, but all of the transactions from year end have not. So that is one place where we have an exception in terms of looking at that budget versus actual. So we're continuing to review all of our accounts as we begin the development of the 2020 budget process. And we look forward to reporting again next month on our expenditures through November.
Thank you, Ms. Michaels. Are there any questions for Ms. Michaels? Looks like everything, Mr.
So
Castillo.
I ask this question each month, so I don't know how much time this is taking you, but is it worth it? And I'll say at VSBA, there was a board member who said, I was convinced that people in central office were doing some budget chicanery, but then they explained the reports to me and it was all good. So to some extent, maybe this keeps everybody calm that they see this, but if you're spending 10 hours a week on this, I would be concerned.
Yes, we are not spending 10 hours a week on this, but thank you very much. Michelle is really working to utilize our Munis tool much better. What I would say is in the past, we had this robust ERP system that we were using kind of minimally, right? So our goal is to use that system to its capabilities in just a much greater sense. So when you look at the data that's in this report, almost all of this data is data where we just download the report, right? We refresh our pivot table and it puts the data right in the table. So what I would say right now is the level of work effort is definitely worth the outcome. I think having consistency in terms of reviewing it each month and being accountable for that is good. It shows transparency. So at this point, I would recommend that we continue to do this.
All right, well, thank you both for your work.
No chicanery.
Any other questions by Mr. Castillo? Excuse me, Mr. Anderson.
We're going to continue the tradition. I'll just, bearing in mind the workload question, I'll just say I really do find these very valuable, and I'm very grateful to both of you for getting these on an ongoing basis. So thanks.
Anyone else? Ms. Wyckoff, you have any? Okay. All right. Thank you very much to both of you for your work in getting these out to us on a monthly basis. Next, we'll turn to the draft of the 2019-2020 school calendar. Dr. Newman.
Great, thank you. I'm actually going to turn it over to Ms. High here in just a second, but before I do that, I do want to say how appreciative I am of the work that she and the team have done in pulling together a couple of different drafts of what the FCCPS school calendar can look like for the 2019-2020 school year. For the board and for the community, as you know, we are in a somewhat limited, we are somewhat limited in the way that we can put our school calendar together because currently we are restricted by start date to after Labor Day. And there was some desire by the school board several years ago to try to end school by roughly June 15th. And when you do that, when you're sort of bookended on both sides, it's a pretty tight window to get 180 days of instruction in, along with the professional development necessary, as well as giving good breaks to families. So last year we had really one option, and this year we have increased our number of options by 100%. We have doubled the number of options and have two this year for consideration by our committee and others. And tonight, Lisa, she describes sort of these options. She's also going to describe broadly kind of what the process is going forward as well. So with that, Ms. High, turn it over to you.
Tonight are two proposed calendars for the 2019-20 school year. And these calendars were developed with a focus on instruction and learning time for students, as well as opportunities to enhance professional development time for staff. This process began in October with our principals, and during that meeting, we looked at our current 18-19 calendar and discussed areas of focus for the 19-20 calendars. What were they hearing from their staff? What were they hearing from the community? A multitude of factors were considered when developing the draft calendars. We looked to make sure that we had 180 instructional days for students, 194 work days for professional staff, looked for the placement for professional development opportunities to be scheduled on days that would be beneficial to our staff. We looked for ways to make sure that we balanced the quarters, making sure that the 4 quarters were balanced throughout the school year. There was a consideration of winter break based on where the January 1st, 2019 holiday would fall. And then we looked at surrounding jurisdictions calendars such as Arlington's 18-19 school year calendar, and then Fairfax's 2019-20 calendar, just to see if there were similarities or areas that we wanted to see if there were any alignment as we presented our calendars. So the two calendars were presented to the full calendar committee on November 13th, and that committee comprised of administrators from every building. We had a teacher from each building. We had someone from our support advisory employee group, the directors of transportation, daycare, HR, the clerk of the board, the chief operating officer, and myself participated in this calendar committee. So as you look at the calendars, they're very similar between the two. And tonight I'll just highlight the areas where there may be some differences. Similarities are the first day of school for students is September 3rd in both calendars. The teachers return in both calendars on August 22nd. And then our PD days and our observed holidays are similar, except for in a few areas. So we'll first start with calendar draft number 1. There is a 2-week, 10-day winter break between December 23rd and January 3rd. We have a professional development day on April 13th, which is the Monday after Easter. GM graduation is June 10th. And the last day for students is Wednesday, June 17th, with a professional day for our teachers on June 18th, which is a little different. There have been 2 days, professional days, some years at the end of the school year, but this year would be 1. And usually 1 is enough because they're tired and ready for summer. On draft 2, it is an 8-day winter break from December 23rd through January 1st, returning on Thursday, January 2nd, which is what we have done other years when January 1st has fallen earlier in the week. There's a half-day professional development day on April 22nd, and we looked at that because on the draft 1 calendar, there was a professional development day on April 13th, but if draft 2, there is not a professional development day, and we wanted to ensure that we gave teachers an opportunity at the end of the 3rd quarter to have a day for some professional planning and grading. June 10th is still the GM graduation date, so that's the same in both calendars. And then the last day for students is Friday, June 12th in the draft 2 calendar. And then professional day would be Monday, June 15th. So when you look at the differences, the difference between draft 1 and draft 2 are January 2nd, 3rd, and April 13th are school days in order for the last day to be June 12th, where in draft 1 calendar, the 2-week winter break, which our teachers have asked for several years, we needed to put those days back into the calendar if we would allow the 2-week break. So are there questions that you have for
Ms. Wyckoff?
So, looking at the calendar, from a student perspective, the idea on draft 1 of having longer breaks is really exciting, but when I see where the school ends and having it end on a Wednesday, has there been talk of how finals week would work in the high school? Because I know that the way that we've always done it is to have 4 days of finals, and I feel like it would be really not optimal to have to start those finals a week and then go into a weekend and have those last 3 days of school.
And there hasn't been a lot of discussion around finals with the high school, but I know the one things that we are focusing on is providing externships and some internship opportunities for students. So that may give us an opportunity to do some more of that at the end of the school year as well. So just really thinking about how we can use that time creatively.
Other questions? Ms. Layton?
I know everybody likes the idea of a 2-week holiday break, but I'm just curious, kind of instructionally, do you feel like those 2 days in January are more useful than the days in June? I feel like there tends to be a bit of fatigue in June. I mean, I'm not sure that 2 days matter, but just thinking of it in that way, what's your sense?
And I mean, we can look at several ways. I mean, with us having to start in September, that means the sooner we end the school year, the testing backs up. So that's as far as instructional time, even at the end of the year, we can have our SOL test and some of the other exams a little bit later if we're giving them. And then in terms of the 2-week break versus having it at the end of the year, we've looked at a little bit at how many students come back or teachers who are out just because they've planned long holidays. And so those are things that we also looked at and considered. So there are times when family will go ahead and stay out the additional time and come back that following Monday. So because we haven't had the 2-week break in a while, it's not data that we have readily right now.
Ms. Gill?
So I know one of the reasons we had asked to end school by the end of the second week in June was because there are opportunities that our high school students and even some of our middle school students cannot take advantage of because there are programs that start that third week of June. My kids are not at that age, but I've heard this from other parents saying, well, my kid would like to participate in X, Y, and Z camp or program, and they can't because we're still in school. So kids are currently leaving school anyway that week and not returning for those 3 days as it is because they want to go participate in a program. So it's just some of the context as to why I think a lot of people are asking, can we end that second week of June?
Ms. Russell?
I guess the only question I had is, was there any consideration given to draft number 3, which would keep the shorter winter break, but also keep the 13th as a professional day, so that the teachers could still have that? I guess I'm trying to think mathematically if that would still work. And then I guess adjust the school end date by that one day. Not to complicate things, but I'm just thinking, I guess my end goal is to make sure that the teachers get that 0.5 additional professional development day, and also the grading time at the end of the third quarter. So would there be the potential for a draft number 3?
We definitely could look at a draft 3. Teachers preferred having the full day on the 13th.
Right, that's what I was
rather than
thinking.
a half day.
So if we could have the 13th as a full day and then extend the school calendar out by just one day with the shorter winter break.
So would students would then come to school on the 15th of June?
Which probably doesn't make sense.
And
Which is
then the work day would be
Monday.
the 16th, so.
Ms. Lee?
This is a question from my bus stop.
Uh-oh.
There's one issue that I keep hearing about. They want to know what happened to the February break.
You mean in terms of, we used to have.
For a number of years, we had 2 days in February. Yeah, and now I'm still hearing about it.
Yes, 3 years ago, we did have February, it would be the February 3rd and 4th, and for the high school, it made their second quarter end really late because it was the end of a quarter. And so there were some challenges in terms of college applications that were due and some of those pieces. So we changed the end of the semester to be earlier and to even out our quarters. So that's why that February went away, because of just when school starts.
The end is moved into January.
Yeah, the end is the 24th of January.
Okay.
So it's really 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks early.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Castillo?
Just to throw this question out here, in terms of the educational value to students, what's the best calendar for educational outcomes? I know some of this is a pick your poison, but those last few days in June always seem somewhat, shall we say, anticlimactic. Thoughts?
I think, we have end of the year events anyway, like field day and some of those. So that's probably where some of those days would happen, is during those last 2 days. And it's a tradition to have those days. So those days will fit in somewhere anyway. So I'm not sure. Of course, we're going to make sure instruction is happening and students are engaged as much as possible, regardless of when. But that's probably not really answering your question, because I would have to pick my poison.
Dr. Noonan?
Right.
Look like we have
Yeah, he's
something
about
to say
to.
here.
I'm like, go ahead, pick it for me.
Yeah, I don't know that there's one versus another that's better. I actually think isolating the last 3 days in that third week of June actually does create a scenario where some things that might have gotten in the way of final exams at the high school, might have gotten in the way of other end of course activities, culminating projects at the middle school or elementary school can really wrap up on that June 12th date, which sort of leaves an opportunity then for those last 2.5 days to really focus on, certainly we would continue to do the externships, but it would give us a place for some of those things that Ms. High was talking about that sort of set apart almost from the school year. And if, we know that there are going to be these celebrations, one of the things we can certainly do is not just talk about how we're going to keep instruction going, but we can systematically also say that there are some celebrations that are happening on these days. It's an end of the year. We've got field days. We've got some other things that are happening, and it's okay. And we're excited about that. The teachers have built these really great relationships with kids. They want to celebrate those. And I actually think pulling them off as opposed to having them sort of in that week of the 8th in June, which there's graduation in there, could really, I think draft one gives us an opportunity to isolate it a little bit to where we actually keep the instruction going all the way through the 12th. Because I look at that week of the 8th, and who knows what can happen the week of the 8th in draft two with all of the other stuff that's also happening simultaneously.
Mr. Anderson?
The other thing that strikes me about ending on the 17th is the for the staff coming in on the 18th, it's the end of the week as opposed to you have the end and then you have a weekend and then you come back, and it just seems like that kind of also presents a little bit of closure in some way, perhaps. So the one that's on the screen right now. On the other hand, I get the concern about folks who want their kids to be able to do things in summer camps and things just earlier. So we're all just getting a taste of everything you guys have been debating for weeks, no doubt. So,
Mr. Castillo?
So, thank you, Mr. Chair, but with respect to students who have things they'd like to do, what avenues exist for them to get their exams done and also go to this? Is that an insurmountable problem? In my experience, there have been ways to do it. It's not ideal, but can we have a way of meeting everybody's needs on this?
One of the places I fall back to is the state requires 180 days of instruction. And so we're putting a calendar together that meets the state requirement. Certainly parents have options, and can, exercise some of those options. I actually think that looking at draft one allows for some of that a little bit more easily, because that week of June 8th would likely be the finals week for our students at the high school, which then does create some flexibility in the 15th, 16th, and 17th for the schools to do some things. So I don't know that I would want to necessarily codify a pathway, because it is a personal decision by a family to make that decision. But there is, if that decision is made by a family, then we honor it. To Mr. Anderson's earlier point about coming back on a Monday, from a purely management perspective, having the negotiations of, coming in on the weekend to not have to come in on Monday and all of that sort of routine that happens, ending on Thursday is a lot easier from a management perspective as well for our principals and leadership.
I'm also wondering if there's some things we can do to really actually encourage some of those activities like field day and that kind of thing to be on those last 3 days. Shauna's looking at me with horror. Look of horror was just
the thought of a June field day when it's already like hotter than the
Oh.
surface of the sun. Day.
I mean, to me, it's just, that's something fun that the kids look forward to. Versus my kids will sometimes say, oh, we're not doing anything the last 3 days. I don't need to go to school. And then I have a bit of a battle with them over, well, it's still a school day. You need to go to school. So was trying to think of what could be on those days that actually encourage them to go to school.
I would just say, you know, if we did adopt draft one, that would be much of the purpose of those last 3 days would be celebrations.
And actually, the more I think about this draft one is, one of the things about the high school is that you have all of these celebrations like the week before finals, and then you have to come back and take finals, and it kind of feels anticlimactic. Like the last day of school is just sitting in a final with like your 120-person class and then not seeing the rest of the school. So I actually think that having all these celebrations after you're done with all of your schoolwork and you're done worrying about studying would actually make the end of school feel more like an end instead of just you're done.
Anyone else?
I'm going to ask Ms. High to talk about what are the next steps in the process.
The next steps is to, as long as the board doesn't object, to send this out and just get a little bit more feedback from our committee member, or the school division, all of the professional staff. I mean, I feel pretty confident based on what the committee shared, and have shared it with their colleagues that draft one will be the one, if we were to put it out for feedback, would be the one to come. So the board could tonight approve if that's something we want them to do.
I would prefer to kick it out to
Okay,
everybody.
that
before
was
we do
our
that.
next step.
Yeah, so we're going to survey staff and give staff, all of our staff, an opportunity to weigh in on these.
But if there was anything additional that the board wanted us to consider, so that we would know before we send it out to the staff, we would want to know that tonight.
Thank you. My only comment would be, and we discussed it a little bit last week in Williamsburg, about some of the things that you all are talking about with your kids and your neighbors with kids, and wanting to wrap up school on and around that second week of June, early June. The waiver request, because I think a lot of the issue is now that with Fairfax County starting school a week early, Loudoun County, I believe, is one of those jurisdictions as well. More and more of those jurisdictions across the state, as to be completely honest, are now wrapping up their school years in late May to early June, which then a lot of these camps and things, this is why a lot of those camps are starting so much sooner than when we're getting out, that I think we should truly, and at least put it out in the community. We have our fall search weight person sitting in the back to kind of put it out within the community and both sides of it. That would both kind of goes sounding boards, at least putting out in the community of getting some feedback of their thoughts of us looking into potentially the waiver. I know most jurisdictions get it for weather and those type things, and I believe that's why Fairfax got it. But even last week with the weather that happened, you know, it affects our teachers because a lot of them do not live in the city of Falls Church, and they have to make that trek from Loudoun County, Fairfax County, and where they may have more of a weather situation than we do, which, in all honesty, I think in those situations we will be not doing our due diligence of opening if we can. But again, you're taking into consideration that we have a fairly significant number of our staff who live in those areas. So it's kind of a multi-tiered reasons to potentially look at potentially applying for a waiver, and going our direction would be going more of potentially our staff and their locations of where they are to potentially look at and possibly put that waiver in. And at this point, for me, it's all they can do is say is no. But I do want at least get some community input on that because it does have an impact all the way around on within the community as well if we were to actually get the waiver and being able to start, I wouldn't say as early as some jurisdictions, but definitely maybe a week or so ahead of the now Labor Day start, that after Labor Day start that we have. So just put that out there for at least consideration of. I know it wouldn't be wouldn't affect the calendar that we would apply that we're talking about now, but could be if we get enough feedback, something that we may want to seriously consider potentially applying for one of the state waivers. And with that, we'll move on to a board norms and succession planning conversation. This is something that I think between myself as well as I know Mr. Anderson, I've had several conversations about it, talking about some of the norms and things that as board members that we should be working on. And I'll let Mr. Anderson talk a little bit about that, and then I will talk a little bit about the succession planning, and then we'll open it up to a conversation between all of us. But I'll let Mr. Anderson get us started.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we've talked a little bit about this in various occasions. Most recently, last week when we were at the VSBA conference, I attended a session about board governance and about board norms, and having the conversation about that, it was a panel discussion with one superintendent and 3 school board chairs, effectively, talking about how they've dealt with it. There was a lot of discussion about the need to get sort of board members to think about their own individual goals. What would they like the board and the school division to achieve, and be able to articulate that in a small package, and then use that in a facilitated retreat as a basis for developing a larger package of norms. So it was a conversation to listen to. I thought there was some good feedback in there. And then Mr. Castillo brought up the document that's on the material for board review 3.02, the roles and responsibilities of the school board document that we have. And that led me to look into my email from a previous VSBA conference, where there was also the Hampton City Schools have developed what they call their agreements and general operating procedures, because I think norms is too short. One has to write something longer. But that document is much more about day-to-day operations and how the board communicates with superintendent and staff, and how media relations get done and this sort of thing. So there's a bunch of material that's available to us to sort of build on, but I think it would be a good idea for us to figure out what are the topics that we want to have a longer conversation about in the space of how do we work together as a board, what are our norms, both in terms of the sort of operational level and how we do that, but sort of making sure that we've got a process for regularly checking in with each other about our longer term goals, about the strategic plan, about making sure that we're getting detailed feedback that we can have in a conversation in a retreat. There was a conversation last meeting about having a retreat in May and June as opposed to in the summer, and being able to use that as a touch point pretty much every year, and I personally think that's a good idea. So these are, sort of topics that I think we ought to really sit down and talk about. I don't think tonight we're going to be able to have the detailed conversation, but at least if we can start identifying ideas and then figure out a process to go forward of what are the topics and how do we actually want to have that conversation. So.
Are there any board member comments? Because I agree that we are trying to come up with some norms and some ways to kind of check in and be able to work on a little bit better of us engaging one another, come up with some common goals of what we'd like to accomplish, or to what I think is a good starting point to be able to do that. I will say, I think as a board, we have worked fairly well together. I think we have all have a common respect for one another and opinions, so that's I think goal number one, of at least having that in place, that gives us opportunity to hear feedback and being able to be, give that critical feedback if need be. But I think that's a good point where We've not always, as a board, been able to do that, but I think over the last couple of years, we've gotten pretty good about being able to have conversations about pretty sometimes sensitive topics and being able to work through them. But I think in the next couple of weeks, a week or so, if you all would start thinking about some things that would be good areas for us to start kind of having a longer discussion about board norms, I think, and I would ask Mr. Anderson to be the person to receive those so that we can kind of start putting that together and then having a more deeper conversation about it would be a good starting point. I don't know if Dr. Newman has any comments you like to share on this.
I just would go, thank you. Just go back to my comments from last time to say that I'd really love to see all of you do some sort of retreat annually in the May-June timeframe. And then I think one of the things that we could do almost immediately is pull out the old governance manual that does exist for the school board. And we could ask Ms. Minson and some others in the staff to sort of update that governance manual with new updated code and look at the working agreements, and then perhaps use that as also a springboard for some of these conversations too, to say, do we still think that this piece of this governance manual is relevant? If not, how do we modify or adapt or change it? But I do think that would take some time. So it may be a good opportunity for us to springboard off of that governance manual.
Thank you. Any comments? You have time to think. Yes, Mr. Castillo.
Well, I guess the thing we probably need to talk about most quickly is the one that really hasn't come up, and that's succession planning, which I think is the single biggest and most persistent weakness this board has had over the last almost 10 years now, I would say. The second thing is I think norms are super important. I will say in all honesty, I was appalled at some of the things I heard at BSBA because they reflected absolute abdication of basic blocking and tackling in terms of governance. I was talking to one superintendent who said he thought you could write up at least 3 of those people for Title IX violations who spoke at the conference because of things they said. If they had been teachers, they would have been written up. And so I think you can't take norms for granted. And as far as I can tell, the best paradigm for if we don't work well as a group, that's when norms become a problem because people start to act individually. And they do things that they should not do if there were better group dynamic. That takes time. I think we need to schedule. We need to have a standing retreat. We need to have a clear and orderly succession plan. We need to have a working understanding with our superintendent. And these are all, I mean, I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer here, but I think we do good work, but I think if we hit a crisis, that's when a lot of these weaknesses will be exposed. And so far, we've been lucky for the last 18 months plus. So I think those are all really big issues.
I think, and I actually agree with you, definitely. It has been a fairly smooth 18 months. Actually, after coming off of a number of years of some bumps along the way that we had. But I agree, that's when you do get exposed for potential things that we haven't kind of always knew were out there, but we just never really talked about it because we didn't have to, because things were moving along pretty smoothly. But I think you're right, we do need to, some of those things you just outlined are very important points to talk about it, getting in place a norm of how we address those particular issues. And the main one that you just said is the next point I would like to talk a little bit about. I do think we do need to put more of a policy or a regulation, I'm not sure which way we would go with it, of how we succeed one another as of leadership. I do think as a board, we all have should be given the opportunity to take on leadership of the board and some type of rotation of that. And my way of looking at it is that generally it should be board chair, vice chair, and that move up and talking within the other members to when that the vice chair steps up, who would be next in line into the vice chair. And it would be the understanding that the vice chair is the person who would ultimately step up into the chair's role in that type of rotation. The big conversation, I think, would be, would we, I know statutorily we have to, in the organization meeting each year, to vote the chair and vice chair in again, but being able to or 2 year commitment type of, if that's, so that we kind of have an understanding of how that works versus kind of what I know when I became board chair, it was kind of the scramble of trying to figure out who wants to do it versus kind of knowing who is next in line to be board chair. Yes, there will be points where that succession plan may go out of whack because someone may have a situation that their job has become busy and they either can't make the step up into the commitments to come with board chair, or if they are, the chair or vice chair, and they may need to step out of it. And so there's not a perfect scenario of that, but at least having the framework in place so we know who's essentially next in line for the board chair versus, and it would be their right of refusal if they so choose not to do it. And then we then know the next person behind who would potentially step into the role. So that, again, it's not a scramble of, do you have time to do it? Do you want to do it? Where I think that's kind of, as to Mr. Castillo's point, I think that's kind of where it has been for the last probably decade or so of how the chair and vice chair has been selected without necessarily a kind of in place order of the transition. So with that, I'll open the floor up to anyone who questions, comments, or kind of ideas of the putting in place a succession plan for us as a board moving forward. Or if there's any on the legal side of how that we're putting in place some type of planning.
I don't think it would be a policy or regulation necessarily, but I do think that would be a good thing to put into the governance manual and the expectations of the board, and have an agreement of the board for what the ideal would be, recognizing that yes, every year there has to be an annual meeting and there does have to be a vote. So even with the best laid plans, people's plans can change or intentions can evolve over the course of time. But I do think it's reasonable for the board to sit down and propose what they think is best for succession planning and include that in the governance documents that the board would be putting together.
And just to add to that, in my former division, after working with the board for 2 years, we did add that language to the governance manual, and it was sort of codified in there to say this is the working agreement that we're going to have.
Mr. Anderson?
I guess I would just chime in and say what you're describing is, in my experience in various other governance situations, pretty standard. Having the sort of, the chair is going to step out and the vice chair is going to step up and a new person's going to come in as vice chair, provides the time for people to come to get used to the additional work that's there, and gives a sense of stability, a sense of planning. But obviously you've got to have that flexibility if something just changes. So I'm perfectly comfortable with that as a plan.
And
comments?
Just a question, would we put some sort of timeline on that as to when? I mean, I know currently it's January, we're expected to put somebody new in place.
I think it has to be January, so that's the first meeting in January will always be that transition point each year. Yeah, I believe it is code. Other comments, Mr. Castillo?
Yeah, and I think it makes for a better board if you have some understanding for this, because if you know that you're going to be doing this next year, you'll pay attention and you'll figure out how to do it. And if you have to start doing it in January and you haven't really done it or been learning about it, then you will be scrambling a little bit. And so I think some of it depends too on the individuals in the board. Not everybody may want to do that, and that's fine. I think there's a wide array of skills that the board can accommodate, but I think at the same time, all things being equal, I think everybody who serves on the board is qualified to serve in that role. And a lot of times I think people discover they have qualities and attributes that they didn't know once they step into that role. So I think that helps us be a learning organization. I think it makes for a stronger board too, because the more circulation you have, the better a group of board members you have. So, and I think the superintendent is happier too, because he's not scratching his head trying to figure out what the heck's going on.
Mr. Anderson?
Just another random thought too associated with it. Of course, there's training opportunities for new chairs and vice chairs through VSBA, through other mechanisms. And the registration time, this is perhaps a dumb point, but it's going to make it anyway. The registration time for signing up for the January sessions starts kind of now. And if you know that you're going to be needing to block off that time, it's practicality that helps. There's other times during the year where they have that as well, and so you can be thinking about those sorts of training.
Yeah, I would just say, going back to the timeline piece, I mean, we know when the switch is made, but it does seem like we should select who the next vice chair is, at least have a discussion, have an idea, and I guess maybe we just have to do that internally, not have a formal process, but earlier than January 1st. So I don't know if we want to put something in place that,
At least December 30th.
Right? Totally. I mean, obviously, we're in a more difficult situation this year because I don't think Phil wants to move into the chair position. So I think usually we would have that, at least the chairperson, it would be obvious who would be coming into that. So it's a little more difficult this year, but to select the next vice chair to move, it seems like it should be early fall, maybe, where we sort of figure that out so that person can begin to plan for that.
I agree with that. It probably would be at least an October window of putting the norm into place, that more so that vice chair change, when that is essentially going to happen, of the vice chair eventually, whomever that may be, starting that whole conversation with board members expressing the interest in making the move up into the vice chair's role. And then we, begin that process at that point. But I agree, it is essential that in the fall, when a lot of the budget type of planning starts to happen, that they are playing an integral role in attending some of those meetings, to kind of get an understanding of what that's going to be. Because when the transition happens, we are literally in the thick of budget season. So that is not you walking into the role in January and having to try to catch up on the budget process. Yes, you paid attention as a member, but it's a little different, I think, when you kind of are the person who has to kind of usher the whole process through passage of within the city council as well. So I think starting at that point is very important to potentially start to do that. But yes, you are correct. This year is a little different. And I think conversations have already started to generally happen about the transition for next year. But I think the sooner we have the conversation of potentially updating and adding some type of succession planning to our governance plan, which could be our first piece of that work, the better off I think we as a board will be of having that important hurdle taken care of how we are going to be transitioning leadership and within the board and members and have a kind of a standard idea of how that's gonna happen. Are there any other comments before we move on to our our last topic to discuss? Mr. Castillo?
So I know we're in a work session, Mr. Chair, but so what do we do next?
So I would think what we would do next, and maybe myself, Ms. Benson, Dr. Nina can at least talk about maybe putting something together and sending out to the board of a possible, something within the governance world to talk about succession and send it out to the board within the next couple of weeks, or if you,
We have,
or if you have some.
we have a model that we could take a look at.
Yeah.
That's being used in a nearby jurisdiction in terms of a piece that goes into the governance manual about succession planning. Could send that out for a look. But I do think you all find yourself right now in a circumstance where somebody's going to have to step up to the vice chair position and chair position. I think we've got 2 vacancies that are coming. So how are we planning for that? I think that's the other functional side of that. It's good to do some of this governance work, but also, January 1st, we've got to name, you all have to name a chair and a vice chair.
And I think some of those conversations of that part of it are happening now, is kind of putting into kind of governance world, and definitely I was just saying, no point to recreate the wheel if there's, models out there already, but to at least put that and send that out for the board to kind of look at and make any tweaks that they feel that are specific to us that may need to happen. I think that's good. But I think kind of that next piece, we're in November now, going into December. I think the conversations are already happening of January, so that we won't be caught flat-footed and kind of moving into that phase. I don't think. Yes.
I guess one thing I do think that we're going to have to iron out as part of this, governance agreement for the succession planning is, the term, because for instance, if the chair decides they want to stay on 2 years, that's fantastic, but that's basically having the vice chair signing up for a 3-year commitment. And so, I just think that not to say that I want to necessarily put term limits on it, but I think we need to think carefully about how that would be extended out in terms of what the vice chair is initially signing up for versus what ultimately might happen. Because the vice chair wanted to be chair for 2 years, or that was their plan. That's a 4-year commitment, and that could even span, they might not be able to serve it out depending on when their term is up. So I think we need to think about that kind of rollover too, in terms of how long the terms are going to last.
That's almost a built-in, and it's more of, I think, a conversation amongst ourselves, how that part of it will work. Because the build-in is it's going to be a 1-year term, and then the conversation would probably happen of whether that person would want the additional year, or as you suggest, maybe having a conversation of, is it something that's gonna yearly? And I don't know if would be a proponent per se of it every
it's
year,
hard 'cause
but
there's
I
definitely
hear,
advantages of it,
I hear what you're saying in that.
Yeah, it goes both ways. I think from a
Exactly.
chair standpoint, I think it makes great sense if you could have a chair, from a continuity stay on for 2 years, but from a vice chair, it kind of extends your commitment where you might be thinking, I'm signing up for 2 years of locking this in, and, then it goes further. And then you get into the whole when your term is at question too, and so that could really kind of hinder us in terms of the succession planning. If you have a vice chair initially has 2 years left on their term, but then the chair stays on for 2 years, so then the vice chair never actually gets to serve as chair if they decide not to run for your re-election. And I think I can imagine, I guess what I'm saying is, it's not surprising to me that the board as a whole has probably had succession planning issues over the years, just because there's a lot of different scenarios where I can see where things get complicated.
Mr. Castillo?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just, to build on that, I think the weakness in the system is not having a vice chair who could be chair, ready to be chair. I think 2 years is not a best practice for anybody to serve as chair. It's too long and it's too tiring. I know that you're completely energized by it, Mr. Chair. Could keep going you forever. But I think a healthy board has constant turnover, a year in, then move up to the next one. Because, you know, we had an instance where we had a lame duck vice chair, and we've had other chairs that for whatever reason were not in a position to serve as chair. And so, to me, it's more important to pick a vice chair who's ready to be chair the next year than it is to pick the chair. Because once the system doesn't function smoothly that way, you're in scramble mode. So.
Good point tonight. Yeah, Mr. Anderson?
The other thing I would point out is there's sort of a balance between the stability that somebody having done it longer serves, but also the equity of members having a chance to serve.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to a longer term, just pure division, you've only got so many people you can have that opportunity, regardless of whether a given person wants it or not. So I would tend to agree with Mr. Castillo's comment about it basically making sense to have it be by default a year. I see the points that you're bringing up too, though, Ms. Russell. So I mean, I don't know. Myself, I would tend to end up on the idea of it being a year rotation and then having that built in as the norms. I don't suppose there's anything that says somebody couldn't then decide they want to go right back to the beginning of the queue again.
Chair, vice chair, I guess you could go to back and forth.
We'd have to have a conversation about that.
Ms. Gill?
I concur with Mr. Anderson, Mr. Castillo on the 1 year term. I think it just makes sense. I think it's churns through. We have I think everyone on this board would do a great job as chair and vice chair. So, I think letting everyone have the opportunity to serve is great. My question is more like logistically, as you noted, there have been many conversations offline about succession for this coming year. But should we be having backroom conversations and one-off phone calls, or like, is there a better way to just formalize that process versus having a lot of like telephone calls and then coming in January and saying like, okay, do we all get our calls? Because there have been many conversations already.
I guess it depends. It leans.
I'm not comfortable with the secretive process. It just makes me feel really uncomfortable. So I just wanted to throw that out there because it just doesn't feel like an open and honest process when it really is. It really is just a very normal process, but it feels like a secret cloak and dagger back room, everyone talking by themselves instead of just saying like, I'll just say, like, I would like to be chair. I think we've all talked about it. I know Ms. Anderson would like to be vice chair. We've talked about sharing the responsibilities. So just throwing it out there instead of piecing it together in back rooms. I don't know. That just makes me uncomfortable. I've never been in an organization that works like that. So if we could make that process more open as well, I think it would be to the benefit of everyone.
Well,
I don't know how other people feel about it, but that's...
Before I pass off to Ms. Minton to make comment, I think putting a plan into place, I think it automatically puts itself into being a way more open process in the future. Yeah, but I guess.
I mean, maybe it is, but I think going forward it will be very clear. But I think this year it's not as clear, although it is kind of clear. I don't know. So again, it makes me personally feel uncomfortable, and it's just a weird position to be in. So I'd rather talk openly with everyone and say, like, does this work for the whole board? Can we all agree, like, as a board, this works for us? Or say, like, this doesn't really work for me. Like, can we talk about it some more?
Ms. Minton, and then Ms. Russell.
The only thing I wanted to point out, I think one of the challenges is you have to either notice an open meeting to have a discussion of 3 or more board members. So I think that's where there do tend to be conversations.
Well, that's what I mean, but there have been, that's what I'm saying, like, there have been, right? So, but now we're in a work session, and then we have 2 more meetings before January, so that it doesn't always have to be a million phone calls, be people, and And again, it doesn't feel like a genuine process at that point, especially because we're really trying to take the politics out of it, I think. By putting in a formal process, we're trying to make it just, this is just what happens, and we all take an opportunity to serve, because it's a lot of time for everyone. It's a lot of time from your family and from your job, so we're all gonna share that responsibility going forward. So to treat it like that as a sharing responsibility and not a political issue.
I think along those same lines too, having it as part of the norms and having a discussion about it also allows for not just the, discussing, okay, Greg, Aaron, whatever, but also talking about, well, what does so-and-so think? Or, so you're getting everybody's opinion and have a discussion like, okay, who's interested? Who's definitely not interested?
Mhm.
So everyone, it's all out in the open, like, okay, well, so-and-so wants to do it, so-and-so at this point in time doesn't work for them. So there's no wondering, am I hurting anybody's feeling, or is anybody being slighted? So it's just a very open and honest and frank discussion about what everybody's, I guess, objectives are.
And I agree with that. I think it's from this point forward, I think it will be a way more open process. I think it's just been that way because it potentially has just been more of the political part of it that has why it was the more kind of behind the scenes, let me line up myself and three more to do the role. So, but I think kind of putting this kind of process in place, which it's not been before, I think does put us in a much better, kind of taking the political maneuvering out of it a little bit, that we know, hey, Aaron, Greg are interested, let's move forward with that, and then potentially this time next year, have the conversation again of who has the time and ready to step into vice chair's role, because at that point we'll know who will move into chair, and then it's figuring out who has the time and ready to step into the vice chair's role. So yeah, just like.
And I'm just wondering if it would make sense, if we're having an annual retreat, to even put that on the agenda, where we're in a little more of an environment where we feel like we can all just talk to each other, like, what's everybody's schedule like, who would be interested?
I would agree. That could be one of our topics for this May, June retreat that we would have, to have that conversation way early and kind of have a process in place that whomever would be stepping into the vice chair role can begin to start kind of maybe taking that deeper dive into some of the major things that are going to be going on within the board, that we'll be starting to make knee deep into literally into starting to build the brand new high school. We're getting ready to break ground. What's that date again, Dr. Noonan?
June 15th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Good. But I think this has been a very good conversation. If you all want to send out the model of governance to the board, to kind of have an opportunity to take a look at that, and if there are any tweaking that any of us want to potentially do with that, and then I think it's a great starting point. And I think this has been a really good conversation to have, so that we can kind of at least check something off of making this board work a little better, and being a little bit more transparent in how we do it. Mr. Anderson, and then Mr. Castillo.
I was just gonna say, if folks do want to send me ideas for norms that we should, I can coalesce this into a document circulated among the group.
Yeah, I would say there's a big difference between, in this area, between collegiality and transparency. I think doing this process in full view doesn't happen. That's not realistic, and I don't think we should be pretending it is. I mean, certainly, if you look at what's going on for the leadership of Speaker of the House, for example, there is some transparency there, but not all of it is productive. So I think this is one of those internal things that we have to deal with ourselves. I think if done right, there isn't going to be a whole lot to talk about, but I think they're two very different strands. So I wouldn't want to over promise on how we make these kinds of decisions, because frankly, there's some very honest discussions about norms and governance that I think are a part and parcel of choosing leadership. And I think we need to have those. I hope we will.
I do believe we will. I appreciate it. Appreciate the conversation, everyone. I think we're moving in the right direction. Next, we will have a conversation about our legislative package. And Ms. Litton?
First I wanted to ask, I don't know if everybody could see the track changes. I have paper copy if anybody wants track changes. You want them? Okay, I'll pass them down.
Kill the trees.
I'm sorry about the tree, but I knew when I looked at it online, I'm like, I'm not sure everybody can see the track changes. So I will just explain a couple of the things I did, and then we can have a conversation if people have other ideas. It's still very much a working document. But just quickly, first, I moved the legislation to return control of the public school calendar to local schools first on our list, just because I thought that seems to be a priority for us. It was kind of buried. You know, I feel like we maybe want to kind of figure out whatever our top couple priorities and put those up front, so they're a little easier to see. Second, I added one bullet on school safety. And this language I took primarily from the VSBA recommendations this year. So I don't know if people have any recommendations on another way to ask for that. If you have, I don't know if anybody has thoughts, but that's kind of where that language came from. And do you guys all agree that's something we are interested in having in there? Is asking for funding related to school safety? Okay. The point on the Health Advisory Board, that had been number 1 on our list. I moved that to the end of this first section. I guess my question with that is that a priority for us? Do you guys feel like that is something important? Peter, I don't know if you've run into this more than we have. It's not something I've really heard much about in our district, but maybe you.
Yeah, this is a state, it's really kind of a statewide issue more than it is a local issue. I actually would, I would hope that you may keep it in.
Okay.
And the reason that it's there is that we want, I think what we want is we want experts making decisions about health, school health. And that school health advisory committee would then be filled with practitioners and people that know about health care and be supportive to the General Assembly to advise them on how to proceed. So an example of that could be if the General Assembly decided we want to make sure that every school has 5 doses of Narcan in their schools, and then suddenly that Narcan in certain communities never gets used year after year after year after year, and the costs are borne by the local school division, it becomes a budget issue for us. But if they were to run that through a health advisory committee, that health advisory committee would say, hey, you know what, there's only been 1 case in the state of Virginia where there's been an overdose. I think that perhaps putting 5 doses of Narcan in a school doesn't make a lot of health sense. And so that advising to that General Assembly from this health advisory board takes a little bit of the reactionary issues that can come from a perhaps traumatic experience and puts it into a broader context.
Okay. Everybody's good with keeping that in?
Could I just ask a question, getting back to the amending the standards of quality to include specific funding for mental health? From a practical standpoint, what does that mean for us? It doesn't mean a 1-for-1 mental health professional. So is that the way we want to say it? Or should we say it differently? Should we say it differently?
You're right, it is not a 1-for-1 because of the way, money flows to us based on the LCI. So any funding that we would get would be at about a 20%, well, less than 20% of what another school division in another part of the state might get. So, I would say, if there's a way to say it where it perhaps provides more flexibility to local jurisdictions, because then we can try to cobble some things together perhaps, or,
But how many divisions do we have in Virginia? 80?
132.
So, I mean, is it outlandish to say one for every division? I know that's not how things usually work, but.
That may be a little hard to
Okay.
get behind. Like, for example, if I were Fairfax County, I would say if I need more than one.
Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying. I think,
So I'm wondering if in that second sentence where it says to include specific funding, we might just want to say to include flexible funding, right? Because then it goes on to talk about at a rate that's commensurate with the current need of school divisions.
What if you just stopped at security personnel? What does that commensurate language really?
So what I believe they're trying to say is, when you look at the standards of quality and when they fund positions, the state often funds positions at a rate that's so far below what everyone else in the district or in the state is doing. So usually that language about commensurate with the needs of our school divisions is asking the state to look at, while the state may set the ratio way down here, if 90% of the divisions are staffing it way up here, they want the funding to be at this higher level, recognizing that the need is much greater than what the state generally says. So I
Because I'm
think,
sort of reading it, that would maybe help Fairfax County to say, well, commensurate with our needs, we need like 20, and
yes,
church you can do without.
so maybe instead of commensurate with the current needs, right, commensurate with the current prevailing practices.
That's practical.
Any more questions on that one? Any thoughts? No?
Then the other change under funding, and we can talk about this, but Greg had raised this, the one about the Virginia Preschool Initiative funding. There was some question just about whether or not that's relevant to us, since we only have one preschool. So thought possibly take it out, just because it wasn't really a priority for us. Any thoughts related to that?
Mr. Anderson?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the question in my mind was, is this, and I'm looking at this side of the table more or less, is this one of the, is this a case where us being a good neighbor is helpful to one of our neighboring jurisdictions, even if it's not necessarily critical for our division?
so there's a couple things in play here. One is, we certainly do get funding for Virginia Preschool Initiative, from the Virginia Preschool Initiative. I think the other part of this funding bullet that's in here is that the VPI budget typically ends up with a significant surplus at the end of the year. And I know that there are a number of jurisdictions, including ourselves, that would like to have a piece of that surplus. And the way that the legislation reads currently is that the funding for VPI has to be used in a very prescriptive way. And so David Bulova, for example, from Fairfax, I think 3 years ago, carried a bill that said, funding could be provided flexibly at maybe a prorated rate at the end of the year based on whatever's left over. And I don't think that it made it through. But I think part of this bullet is about being able to potentially use some of the untapped VPI money that would be available.
So would you
And we would
recommend-
be, and we'd be a good neighbor if we could.
Okay, so you think leave it as is?
I don't think it hurts us.
Okay.
Personally. But this is your legislative package.
People are good with leaving it in, just checking. Okay. All right, any other thoughts, comments, things we're missing that you'd like to see?
I took a look at the vast legislative package that Dr. Newman sent out. I think addressing the teacher shortage would be a useful thing to do, because I think that's a big, important issue for us.
I would agree with that being an important something to potentially add in, that we run into some issues there as well, and also just, again, the good neighbor, because we all, I think, have experienced that shortage, and would be something good for us to possibly add in.
So the first bullet, the first series of bullets in the vast legislative program actually speaks to that shortage of qualified teachers, and speaks first to teacher salary should be above the national average. In Virginia, the average teacher salary is $51,000 and the national average is $60,000. So we're $9,000 short of the national average in Virginia. The second bullet is about adding state funding for needed enhanced mentoring programs for new teachers. And then the last is about allowing localities to be able to create an alternative assessment for teachers who are on a provisional that have trouble passing the praxis. And one of the things we know, and I could speak from personal experience, I had a teacher who was one of our best teachers in special education, worked with kids tremendously, worked with families tremendously. We saw great gains in their student achievement, but could not pass the praxis for a variety of reasons. And so at the 3-year mark, we had to cut the teacher loose and say, I'm sorry, you can't teach here. But if there were some flexibility, considering a teacher shortage that we're experiencing, to say, based on student performance and their evaluation that we've done, we think that they should be allowed a waiver that would potentially allow us the opportunity to waive some teachers in without perhaps getting that praxis score. I think it's actually a nice idea as we create multiple pathways for teaching, considering the current teacher shortage.
And I will say there are a number of states across the country that have done something similar. I mean, they've done it in a lot of different ways, so I don't know exactly how Virginia would want to do it exactly, but we would not be out of step with, I'd say, about half the states in the country doing some sort of waiver or alternative to passing praxis. The one other thing I would say on teacher pay, just sort of generally to be aware of, I think that's kind of interesting, is Maryland has done, and they've spent 2 years looking at a number of issues, and a big one is teacher pay, and they're going to have a significant legislative package that's really going to significantly raise teacher pay if they're able to get it through the legislature. So given that they're our neighbor, I think it continues to put even more pressure on us. They're setting a minimum, plus if you get national board certified, I mean, the jumps there are going to be really significant. So if they're able to get that through, so I would agree that we should at least maybe say something around that issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just say on the issue of teacher pay, I would, and my computer died, so I don't have the language, but I think we should say increase average teacher pay to exceed the average, but also to take into account the higher costs of living in various jurisdictions, because I think our teacher pay is above that $50,000 average for Virginia. So I think we would want to make that clarification.
I was thinking the exact same thing of that, because I'm just going to say for our region, we're definitely above, and depending on what Maryland does, it could impact us. Depends on what they do, how it would impact us. But definitely, I think we're at a different point of where our teachers are getting paid versus the potential of the downstate folks. Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, we've got the point in here about continuation of the cost of competing factor. I almost just wonder if there's a way to amplify that language somehow to deal with the fact that we're not just talking about competing with other parts of Virginia, but, you know, across the border in Maryland. I don't know. It's in here, so it's a place we could start as a basis, I suppose.
So Ms. Meyer, could you explain a little bit, would the cost of competing get us where we need to be on that kind of thing?
So the cost of competing factor, what it does is it looks at the cost, particularly in this Northern Virginia area, and it applies an additional factor to the funding that the state provides us for our SOQ funded teacher positions. So it certainly helps, right? It does make a difference, but it just impacts the amount of state funding we receive for those SOQ funded positions, which goes through that local composite index.
It's a fraction of a fraction.
It's a fraction of a fraction, but we'll take every fraction we can get.
And to add to it, it would be helpful, you know, under the funding, we do put in that fourth bullet, looking for them to go back on the support cap piece as well. And if they were to fund the support side of the house, the way that they fund the instructional teacher side of the house, it sure would be helpful. Can I have one last thing? Just one quick insight that I got from our local senator at VSBA that may be helpful. And I don't know if everybody here knows, but the Senate Finance Committee had a retreat at Kings Mill Resort the same nights that we were staying there. And Mr. Castillo and I were able to corner Senator Saslaw and ask him some questions about the upcoming budget. And not to get too detailed or deep into the weeds, but it does look like revenues are looking pretty good on the state side. And so that's sort of exciting as a possibility. So maybe some of this will happen.
And just to continue embarrassing Dr. Noonan at every possible turn, turns out Dr. Noonan has jumped out of an airplane. So he's in addition to his musical and operatic skills, I learned in our conversations with Senator Saslaw that he was a one-time parachutist. So keep surprising us, Dr. Noonan.
I got to keep the mystery alive.
Ms. Layden, is that helpful for you before?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and try and incorporate some of those changes and send out another draft for you guys to take a look at.
Sounds good. All right. There are a couple pieces of materials for board review. And if there's nothing else for the good of the order, we stand adjourned for tonight. Thank you all very much.